So welcome to the Compassionate Capitalist podcast show. I'm Karen Rands, the host. And of course, the goal that we have on this show, if you're watching live on, or you're watching on YouTube, you can say hello. And if you're listening in, you can check the body notes and see the YouTube video of this interview with my special guest, Tico Blumenthal. And the purpose of the Compassionate Capitalist radio show is to promote the idea of compassionate capitalism. And so I always like to start with an explanation of that. And so everybody makes, capitalism is something that is integral to, particularly in the United States. It's core to a lot of what we value in the United States. And it's about buying and selling to be a capitalist. You just buy and sell to make money. The idea of compassionate capitalism is sort of coexists with conscious capitalism, but compassionate capitalism is when investors choose to take a portion of their portfolio, their investment strategy, and allocate it to invest in entrepreneurs, to invest in the passion of that entrepreneur so that they can bring innovation to the market, create jobs, and create wealth. And hopefully that innovation is doing something that's going to change the world and make it better for everybody. And there's a value proposition there. And so because there's so many different changes in the marketplace as to how companies can get access to capital and so many more new investors coming into the marketplace, I wrote my book, Inside Secrets to Angel Investing, to be a primer for that and to really compel people to think about adding entrepreneurism to their portfolio. It's how we grow our economy. It's how we think of everything you've ever used or you use and what would be very appropriate for today, medical advancements comes because there was an investment in that company at the very early stage and they were at the idea. And so when I met Tico, I asked him to come on the show because he has a unique perspective through the life science angels on investing in this medical space. And it's a little bit of a different beast than, say, a software tech or a regular hardware tech or, a lot of the things that traditional angels might invest in. And it's something that a lot of times baffles entrepreneurs on how to find capital for that. So we're going to be talking to an audience of investors and entrepreneurs to understand some of the best practices within the space. And Tico brings a tremendous amount of experience from living on both sides of the equation as the entrepreneur as well as the investor. And so let me introduce him real quick and then I'll bring him on. So Tico Blumenthal is the co-chair of the Medical Device Screening Committee of the Life Science Angels and the head of Global Strategic Marketing at Cardinal Health Cordis Interventional Vascular Division. Tico brings over 15 years of operational experience in sales, marketing, and innovation management in medical devices, including over 10 years with Medtronic, where he co-founded and developed Medtronic's Innovation Center in Shanghai. Tico is passionate about serving the aim of better health globally and advises and invests in a diverse portfolio of early-stage ventures, including implantable diagnostics, cardiovascular devices, and digital health. He holds a BA from Dartmouth College and a BE and MS from Thayer School of Engineering at Dartmouth. So welcome to the show, Tico.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I always like to get started with a little bit of your journey as to how you went into the life sciences space. How'd you ended up over at Medtronic? Just sort of, a little bit of your journey that kind of got you to where you are today.
Awesome. Well, I definitely explored quite a bit. I was lucky to have the opportunity to try some different things early on during my academic career. I had the good fortune to work with JP Morgan as an investment banking analyst, to see that side of the business, to work with some German aerospace materials analysts doing X-ray diffractometry, and worked in London for an internet startup. So I was aggressively trying to find the spectrum of opportunities, since I think when everyone's starting out, you don't know what's on the other side of the decision to start your career. So I was lucky enough to start finding passion around medical technology during my undergraduate education, and then had a chance meeting with a couple of guys from Medtronic who actually dragged me over to the commercial side, who said, don't go into a sub-basement and try and design the future. Understand how the business works and the point of sale, the real clinical environment and then go try and change things. And that was some great advice. So when they came back offering me a job, that's really how I launched into medical technology out of my graduate education. I knew I liked the human application of engineering since it really is a very concrete and personal way to invest your time. So had the good fortune of finding that connection early on. Worked in sales, supporting implants in the operating room, doing the cardiac rhythm support, working with patients as they come in through the emergency department and being actually in the operating environment, and then doing after implant support and things like that. So as I was part of launching products and in some cases helping manage recalls in the field, I got some passion behind being able to help shape how patients were being served by medical technology, both by understanding the gaps in terms of the clinical realities, but also by seeing unserved needs that yet hadn't been identified. So that kind of powered me into my corporate career with Medtronic. So worked in innovation management, global marketing, upstream marketing, and then, as you mentioned, started working on a number of different projects, including some business development work from a corporate investor standpoint, doing diligence on different opportunities, and had the opportunity to work in Asia and to some extent support that same type of work as well as needs identification. So after I came back from China, I had the opportunity to work in some newly established business units for Medtronic and then worked in a startup myself. So I experienced some of the cliche mistakes as an entrepreneur, but I also got engaged both with other startup founders who I invested in some cases, but also got to know the investor community from the standpoint of pitching a lot of different investors, raising capital from certain investors, and then ultimately, because of some good luck in terms of personal investing, have the opportunity to be an accredited investor as well. And one of the things that I did as I transitioned to the Bay Area as part of my current role with Cardinal Health and the Cordis business is I found some of the investors that I had talked with and really found some great feedback from were from Life Science Angels. And I was lucky enough to gain admission to that group and really was drawn by the amazing people. And like all angel groups, it's an affiliation of individuals rather than a sort of centrally driven organization. And so I think when the opportunity came up to be able to help add value and provide some perspective and invest my time on behalf of the larger group of individuals at LSA, I happily jumped at the opportunity.
Yeah.
So,
okay, so the Innovation Center was a corporate job, but really on the innovation side. So you were kind of like what they might call an entrepreneur, kind of
exactly
working as sort of the entrepreneur inside of a company and have the nice of having resources. That's when right. I was with IBM, I had an opportunity to be in that kind of a role and bringing products to market and things. And so then you did a startup and went through the process of, creating the value and explaining and that side of the equation. And now you're in a corporate gig at Cardinal?
That's great.
Oh, okay. So then you moved in, so you have that, but you use your excess liquidity to be an accredited angel. So you really are a compassionate capitalist. That's one of those kind of, yeah. So that's one of the things that I tried to explain and who I try to compel within when I did Inside Secrets to Angel Investing is that there's millions of people in corporate jobs that are accredited investors based off of a W-2 and their assets that have never really understood that they can even participate in this asset class. So that's interesting that you had enough of a passion for entrepreneurism that says when you transition through to that, you say, I'm still going to be in there. I still want to be a part of it because, I mean, I think in one of the areas, if you look at sort of the societal good, life sciences, I would guess you would think that's probably one of the areas compared to like create another game, whatever, right? It's like you're actually doing something that might help people overcome an illness or prevent an illness or recover faster or have a quality of life that something has, whatever that might be. Everybody loves entertainment, and there's nothing to be, wouldn't want to diss on that too much. I'm just saying it must be a very rewarding area to be in.
I think I definitely don't look down on technologies that improve people's quality of life. I think just making sure that is part of it. It's very easy, though, as you mentioned, to be mission driven when you're working in health technology. And I was lucky enough to spend a good chunk of my career with a company that really kind of figured it out, thanks to Earl Bakken and his founding of that company and making a mission around relieving pain, restoring health, and extending life. And ultimately, it's personal, and it touches people in our families and around us. And I think a lot of the people who invest their careers in health have a really kind of a mission-driven element. When I was in college, I started with a number of other individuals, a nonprofit to do resource development in the water and sanitation category. It's currently called Dartmouth Humanitarian Engineering, I believe. And it really kind of helped me understand that, when you make sure that different parties benefit, it's a more durable solution versus if you come in with the idea that something doesn't need to have an economic driver. It's often you get the curtain effect where when your hand is done pushing the curtain to the side, it falls back to whatever the default is. And so for me, compassionate capitalism is about making solutions that take into account the incentives that make durable solutions. And I think that definitely carries over into healthcare. We're not a charitable group of individuals. We want solutions that are also businesses, because ultimately those are lasting solutions because people are driven by their own incentives to make it happen.
Right. So, when I ran my angel investor group here in Atlanta, the Network of Business Angels and Investors, life sciences was something we simply just didn't do. We didn't have the expertise in it. There tended to be a longer development cycle, a little bit more money that went into it. And so there's a certain appetite, a certain kind of investor, certain kind of a way of thinking about it. So, based on maybe because of within the life science angels, or as you have, do you have investors or experience with investors, or maybe your own self, where they were traditional tech investors and then they would come and participate in life sciences because there was just something? I've seen many compelling solutions that are problem solvers that was very sad to me that they didn't get all the way through to, because it was hard for them to raise the money. So talk a little bit about the process of how you look at a life sciences company, and if somebody was a traditional tech investor, how they could maybe overlap, what the difference, and how they might take that skill set and apply it to life sciences if they wanted to, if they saw something that they thought was really good and they needed to do sort of a litmus test on it to see how it fits compared to, traditional types of angel tech investments.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's really a very timely question, because you see here in Silicon Valley that health is converging with tech in many respects. Apple and Google already have significant investments in health, are really focused on it, and are investing in a way to really yield a new ecosystem level technology related healthcare experience for patients. And so I think there is a lot of convergence between tech and health. And I think maybe just to start at the beginning, the things that are the same are that you're really looking for ideas that are a business rather than a technology. You're making sure that you have a customer that you understand.
Sure.
And you have a path to exit that is at least feasible theoretically. And I think a lot of times, like any type of technology, you get a lot of ideas that are not mature, in part because either the technology isn't built or it isn't validated, or it's based on some innovation that hasn't happened yet. And ultimately at LSA, we really like to see that initial human feasibility, or have at least a strong in vivo feasibility that says this is likely to work. So it's either a giant market and it's worth a shot, or it's relatively low risk, but it's also very likely to work, even if the multiple is not quite as high. So there are a lot of different pathways that medical devices have, and actually a lot of categories are relatively quick and cost-efficient paths to market. If you look at orthopedics on one side, is a classically relatively fast path to market through the 510K process. The tests are well defined. I think if you're looking at newer categories, for instance, like AI, those paths are actually prioritized by FDA, so you can have direct conversations around what the bar is. And so I think certain elements of risk are really burned down. That said, even as life science angels, we don't want to generally, unless there are certain circumstances that make it a good idea, we don't invest in original PMAs. We do tend to invest in 510Ks or lower class devices overall. We do a lot of chronic implants, but I'd say generally speaking, there is a higher threshold for investing in an original PMA, in part because they're almost certainly likely to need to raise venture rounds because of the cost of that, and that'll never be good for angels. So
sure, yeah. So for our listening audience, what a PMA is?
Pre-market approval study. So it's more
for the FDA, right? The FDA, yeah, before they've actually gone through their, and so like, that's when it's a pharmaceutical, then there's different stages of the testing that they have to do. And then if it's a medical device, is it the same sort of testing? Do they have to go through that same sort of lab testing and stuff?
Generally speaking, there is going to be stuff like biocompatibility, but the amount of analytical testing that you need to do on a molecule to ensure that it's going to be safe is quite different than what you need for a physical implant that has a mechanical mechanism of action, for instance. So I think when you look at the path to market, it's much faster for devices where a lot of times a product can get on the market in 12 to 24 months if you have a finalized design, versus if you look at drugs, obviously the pipeline is much longer. However, generally speaking, the markets tend to be gigantic if you're going to fund a product through the pharma lifecycle. We also do that. However, we make sure that we either have an expedited path to market through a targeted indication that would allow it to have either a clear opportunity to demonstrate efficacy or has an expedited pathway because it's a rare disease, for instance. And the FDA is looking to make it feasible to get new therapies for those patients by lowering the bar and requiring more work afterwards to make sure that it's safe, simply because you don't have enough of a population to do the traditional approach without prohibitive expense. So they are trying to make it work, even though they want to be disciplined. They balance the path to market based on the risk profile and versus the need profile of the patient group. So it's a very reasonable approach, and yeah.
Okay, so if you can, I would love to hear an example. So how long have you been with Life Sciences Angels?
So this is my second year with them. And I've done 5 investments with them, and so it's something where there are some really positive developments for some of those investments that I've done as part of the group. However, it's still early days.
Yeah, so I was going to ask if maybe you may not have this example, if you had one that you had invested in that actually, traversed all the challenges and things and actually came with a positive outcome that you could say, here's what was right, here's how you knew, and then one that you didn't, that you thought had all the right indicators, but for whatever reason didn't make it, and what you learned from that process to going forward on sometimes you can't predict anything. That's that's why they have the 10 company rule thing. But it's like, if you have something like that you could share, I would be, I think, truly beneficial to the audience.
So I definitely have stories from my corporate investor days. However, a lot of that stuff remains confidential for predictable reasons.
Company A did something like this, or just the general, whatever you feel like you can share as like the best practices for, or just an experience on.
Yeah. So let me take an example of a product that I funded through to commercialization that actually has done really well so far, and ultimately I think with any new to the world technology, there's going to be some types of risks. However, the process to mitigate those risks is fairly straightforward. Ultimately, you just identify the best expert thinking, you find some contrarians, and you really look at the risk-benefit profile. Pretty much like any other category investment, you really look at what's the balance of potential outcomes, and do you have enough reasons to believe that specifically the degrees of freedom are controllable. So is the fundamental mechanism of action clearly understood? Is there reimbursement already existing? And I think these couple things really are the difference between investing in a research project, which is kind of a common pitfall of early stage medical investment, versus investing in a business. And ultimately, you want to invest in businesses because that's what makes real patient value, is when you have enough simplicity to have confidence that you understand what you're putting your money into. That said, so there are always going to be surprises. It just depends on where they come from. And I think it's really kind of a cliche, the things where as a corporate investor, it's been easier to put money in is where you have people who have clearly demonstrated same category, same technology category success, and investing in people who have made the mistakes themselves is it's the most predictable kind of investment that I can have. I think one of the challenges on the other side, there are some examples in interventional cardiac rhythm that sometimes you do a lot of diligence on a company and it looks good, but there's some undefined risks. Ultimately, it's sometimes as a corporate investor very hard to pull the trigger until you have sort of FOMO come in and have the belief that perhaps there are only limited options in a category. So if one is gone and there is only one remaining, that's the fastest transaction speed that I've ever been involved in. So I'd say you're looking for indirect indicators of success, and usually that's just either you have one option to run to, and you know that to get the growth you need to go there. Otherwise, look for patterns that have been established by the same people that you're investing in, and that there's a clear and simple path to market. I think usually the degrees of freedom that are obvious at the investment stage, where you see a risk, those things usually tend to be they turn some very small things into very big things over time if they're not really well characterized, and you look for experience to really be the risk mitigator there. Hopefully that's clear. I know it sounds a little high level, but there are specific examples behind it.
Yeah. So, well, it's actually fairly consistent with other types of early stage investing, right?
That's it.
You always want to know who the validated customer is, the authentic customer who's really going to use this. And as you stated before, it's not like a one-shot rifle kind of a thing, so that the curtain just doesn't, I like that example you used of the curtain, right? So that there's a market that then you can evolve in, or you can find other uses for that, or, you can evolve your product. And then you've got, even if it's a failed experience, at least in entrepreneurs that have had an experience, and if they did have something that they failed, they learned from it. So
Yep.
They know some of those mistakes, and then they can build a team. You can build a team with others. So, because the old adage that a B product with an A team will beat a product with a B team.
It's funny because I do generally believe people will figure it out. It depends on where you draw the line for B product, though.
Well, given enough time and money, they can figure it out.
That's
theory,
true.
Right?
Very true. It's a lot easier, I think there is, because of the regulatory bar, you really want to have that confidence that the product is at least reasonably close to the final version, because there is kind of cost and time related with revisions. It's not as bad as in pharma or biotech, but ultimately, you don't want to increase your burn duration before you're generating the revenue that you really believe the opportunity justifies.
And so, the thing I think about this is that, so because where you are, most of the life sciences investors that I've talked to and the different funds that I've known in the past that did this, they always wanted after it, they know, or at least have someone on the team that knows how to get the 510 filed, or they're close to that, because it can be such a cash burn getting to that point. So what do startups do that have, do they all stay within the university research system, or there are grants out there? I mean, who's going to, you know what I mean? If the guys that are experienced about this say we want this level to meet, but it costs money for them to get to that level, what are the options for those idea stage companies to get it, you know, to find the funds to get to that level?
Yeah, you know, it's a great topic, because a lot of times that's our advice to folks who have come to us a little bit too early, is to really make sure that you've explored the non-dilutive funding landscape. And I think there's actually a lot of really successful entrepreneurs who have developed relationships with the various institutes that provide SBIR type funding. Also DoD. There's a lot of different grants in the environment, and I think really people underutilize that, especially for that early feasibility stage where they don't have that animal data, they don't have that kind of confidence that their idea will work. It's a good concept, but it's very hard as experienced investors to invest in something where it's just a concept, especially because a lot of times in those initial feasibility studies, you learn things that mean you have to rev your product.
Yeah.
And so that's really if you've kind of gone through at SBIR, you really want to engage with experienced advisors to make sure you're generating the evidence that's going to not only tell you if your thing is working, but also get it closer towards the customer's quality criteria and the payer's quality criteria. Because sometimes if you're doing it right from the beginning, you can actually generate enough evidence to get into clinical pilots really quickly if you have the right information that you've collected. So there's a lot of non-dilutive options. Obviously, if you look at even accelerators are proliferating for medical technology in various hubs. In Minneapolis, there are a couple. UW-Madison is continuing to invest in medical technology acceleration. Also, Boston has a ton of great accelerators, not only for putting in funding, but often connecting people to resources without necessarily impacting the cap table. So
yeah,
I would go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, like on your website, lifescienceangels.com, it talks about sort of this cultivation, I guess, where you probably have syndicated with some of these accelerators, so you help entrepreneurs find the resources that they may need if they're not yet ready for you guys, and then when they're ready for you guys, you've got some additional resources that you bring to them besides the money.
Definitely. So that's really when you have a focused angel group like LSA, that's really the goal, is to be able to bring value to the entrepreneurs. You have a great mix of clinicians and industry, as well as professional investors, finance-focused individuals, some venture participants as well. And while some of our membership overlaps with other angel groups like Sandhill Angels or Band of Angels, you can see that when you have a member get excited and like the baseline technology, a lot of times we invest our time to help those companies, connecting them to clinical validation, connecting them to these accelerators that we do collaborate with to make sure we have good deal flow and are seeing the companies early and can help them at least understand the views of experienced people in the space. And I personally love investing in companies where an experienced deep content expert is saying, hey, I love this. For instance, if a well-known cardiologist in our group is saying, hey, this is a great interventional cardiology tool, and I'm going to use my network to get that validation and build that preliminary momentum, that's really convincing, I think. And all angel groups tend to be very collaborative. However, at the end of the day, they are all individuals. And so I think finding those champions who can incubate and work with those startups to bring them to the point where they are ready for investment, I think is a very good reason for entrepreneurs to get on the radar of angels as early as possible and find those individuals. Really, at the end of the day, it's a person-to-person relationship that can bring you in from the inside and ultimately get you to the point where at least your risks are mitigated to the point where a portion, with a deal lead, a portion of the membership can invest.
Yeah. Okay, so as we start to wrap up here, you touched on it a little bit in the beginning about how tech and life sciences are kind of converging. So,
Yes.
You see it, Internet of Things. It's been really interesting. That kind of stuff started, the baby steps of that was, a long time ago, 20 years ago, back in my days at IBM, we were kind of talking about, at that time, it was like, what was Bluetooth going to be used for? You would connect all these things around your office, and everybody thought, oh, what's that, right? And then now, as it moves into the life sciences area, it's how all of the devices talk to each other, and then that leads into big data types of decisions and analytics, and monitoring things and stuff like that. So, talk a little bit about where you see some of these technology trends happening in life sciences, and something that you're sort of watching, and maybe it's not fully mature yet to be investing in, but you're kind of keeping your eye on, trying to find, looking for companies in that space that you think is, like on a threshold or something that's going to be transformative to the market.
Yeah, to be honest, I think there's a lot of really transformative baseline work that is happening now. I think the work that I'm peripherally aware of that Apple is doing to make their system a platform for mobile EMR, I think is really going to enable a lot more interesting holistic views of patients as they're living their lives, and provide a more complete understanding of what the impact of interventions are, and ultimately how to close the loop to make sure that people can live healthier by getting more practical, life integrated solutions to help people live better. So I think that's a really compelling angle. I'd say huge amounts of data proliferation. In my neighborhood, there's a number of organizations that are really trying to integrate all the omics into a single platform, which will definitely lead to some very interesting alignment, cause and effect, hopefully, in terms of genetics of not only you as an individual, but of the organisms that occupy your gut and perhaps live in your bloodstream. So I think getting a better sense of all those pieces is definitely a thought-provoking category. Ultimately, I think the simpler, more direct value that you can find is going to have a better ROI, in part because there are less degrees of freedom. These sort of moonshot pieces will have some challenges because there are so many degrees of freedom, and in some ways they're changing the clinical basis for decision making. And just to give an example, if you look at the old model for diabetes, is you have a out of range high blood sugar, and then you whack it back down, and that's keeping a diabetes patient healthy in the clinical framework. But if you give them a continuous monitoring stream, suddenly you're seeing curves and rates of change and cycles in the day and food-related interactions and things that ultimately you have to relearn what they mean. It's different. A contour is a different thing than a point measurement. And that's a simple example where a lot of our body has much more complex system interactions. And so when you turn something from a point into a contour or a 3D map, ultimately it changes the clinical rationale, especially if you move upstream as another example. If you, for instance, had a biopsy and it is cancer, it's very different than saying, hey, there's perhaps pre-cancer earlier in that diagnostic pathway. So I think the things that take the current clinical process and really look at the successful high efficacy interventions and then just make them more appropriate, I think that's where the near-term value is. By helping people do what they're doing now, but more efficiently or more effectively, I think that's where the kind of next few years of big value will happen. And I think just to give somebody an example of what something like that looks like, I think CathWorks or HeartFlow in interventional cardiology, if you look at how they are trying to get more appropriate interventional cardiologic intervention, so do you stent or not stent, I think these types of interventions are so close to what people are doing now that they're really an immediate amplifier if you can implement them correctly. Just less degrees of freedom.
Yeah, I've seen some of those kind of solutions, particularly in the cardio space lately. Interesting, like 2 companies in Atlanta were at 1 million cups. It's the Kaufman thing they do for pure startups to kind of practice pitching. And one was for a early onset to, based on the data, that when somebody has arrhythmic or has very irregular heartbeats, or they have a risk. So instead, it almost, I guess there's some indicators they now know of when a heart attack's about to happen, and they can, something where it can, so it'd be interesting to see, like you say, all these data that we better understand through the genome research, and we better understand our bodies, our biochemistry, and now all the stuff, if we ever get a chance to actually start doing any kind of cannabis research to understand how the cannabinoids all intersect with the 100 different receptors in the body. I mean, that's all DNA kind of stuff based. And so, it's just, there's a fascinating one will come in the next decade, I'm sure.
Definitely. I think that heart attack alert is a great example of perhaps the former type of innovation, where you're bringing somebody who previously had a definitive heart attack, and maybe this person who comes in a little bit earlier has a non-diagnostic, or at least is a different thing that you're observing, because you're seeing the preclinical onset where they may not have symptoms. And is intervention still the right thing to do because they had a different history of care? If you have pain and you see a clot, then you should do X, Y, Z. Does not necessarily extrapolate to, I see an electrical signal and some variation in that diagnostic. It doesn't map to that old clinical thought process. And so I think there's just going to be more evidence potentially required as you have to reboot that clinical logic to say, what do I do with this thing? Am I sending that person on a medical odyssey where they're going to get more intervention, to do diagnostics, to try and figure out what this thing is that this new technology identified? And I'm saying, try and set your sights a little bit closer to the current, so you can say, just do what you're doing now, but more appropriately or at the right time. I think that kind of thing is going to be lower hanging fruit.
Okay, so last question that I just thought of as you were talking, saying that last part there. So is there, with all these advancements and like even that kind of stuff, and you say there's a human behavior within the medical community of how they've done stuff, right? Earlier you were talking about some of these things that we're trying to do to learn how to be what you were talking about, Apple. So it's more about preventing illness rather than just treating illness. And we're a big pill prescribing country to, people have stuff and then they take a pill. And so there's things that you could do, all kinds of stuff, regardless, like take the genetics out of it, that you could do that would maintain and not have onsets of various incidents and things like that. So how long will there be an overlap, or is the medical community, what they're teaching in processes and schools and they go through the residency, is it keeping in lockstep with technology advances, or is there some kind of is there any kind of disconnect on some of that stuff? I mean, that's you probably can't even answer that on a broad stroke like that, because it probably varies by community and community, but
I think it's true. I'd say it really depends. I'd say medical education has actually undergone a lot of transformation. A lot of people who've gone through med school in the last 10 years seem to have a lot more appreciation for the patient voice. I think there's a lot of changes that are happening. Ultimately, you do want to be conservative in patient care to minimize patient harm. Take the established methods until you have demonstrated superiority where possible. I think, as a patient, I hope that people are doing that versus, implementing a faulty credit card processing startup app is very different than implementing a faulty answer. And so I think ultimately, I think there's a lot that's possible. However, I think medicine and clinicians are rightly conservative in their approach to adopting. I think piloting makes a lot of sense, but ultimately your evidence development strategy for things that impact care has to be part of your commercial path. And I think there are a lot of younger, innovative doctors that I have the pleasure of interacting with who are really pushing forward medicine and pushing forward their practice. Nothing is homogeneous though, and I think it's something where there's a reason why we need both early adopters and late adopters to keep the system functioning.
Yeah. I see it all the time with companies that my investors have invested in and I've invested in that, you know, they got so far and the scaling part was really a challenge because there are so many pockets of innovation happening in different places, and you know just getting 100 clinics or whatever using it, you think that's really great, but it really, to be the solution that gets widely adopted, it has to be it's I think that's where that's nice that you're one of those, if your organization is one that can go and fund them through that process, and then they can grow through revenue where you get the not having to be crammed down by VCs because they raise 20 or 30 million dollars to manage this growth as they go from 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 clinics, you know, kind of a thing. Then that's hopefully your organization, Life Science Angels, is able to give them a good pathway to grow, you know, with sustained, you know, steady growth, to not get ahead of themselves, to, you know, create revenue, create the value, create not the curtain, you know, all of those things, right? So, so anyway, I think it sounds like that's kind of where y'all's mission is at Life Science Angels.
Yeah, you know, I think helping technologies and navigate their way to the clinical environment is really something that is easy to get passionate about. We have to make sure that it's an angel appropriate deal, and I think that's a key thing. If you do want to establish a national sales and marketing framework from an angel investment, you need to probably have a pretty good business model to enable that. Otherwise, you're going to need to compete with venture money, and I think ultimately that will make it less of an angel-friendly investment. So hopefully, if people are coming to LSA, I think having a reasonable, either a great business model or an exit strategy that enables that closed loop in a reasonable amount of time is critical to the investability of the opportunity.
Okay, well, that's about all the time we have, Tico. I thank you very much for coming on to the show. I've learned a lot. Hopefully our audience has learned, you know, just all the different kinds of things that it relates to life sciences as a sector of the marketplace for angel investment and for entrepreneurism, so, and innovation. So anything you'd like to say as your final on asking people to contact you, or if you have any resources on your website that they might be able to look at?
Yeah, so first of all, Karen, thank you for your passion for entrepreneurs and for helping build your community and your region. LSA is very interested on the investor side in finding other angel groups to syndicate with. And hopefully with our depth in life science, we can add value to the investments that you have. And we're always interested in seeing what's on your table.
Okay.
For the entrepreneurs who are watching your program, I think it would be great to hear from you. Ultimately, if you are really a life science company or focused on health, I think there are usually people who can get passionate about what you do. So the best way to do that is we really do make sure we close the loop with everybody who applies on our website. However, if you feel like something in my background connects to what your team is doing, I'm happy to be a resource as well. So I think, again, thanks, Karen, for the opportunity, and I look forward to following your podcast in the future.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tico. Have a great rest of your day. Onward and upward.
Thanks, Karen.